Hello and welcome to Unspeakable Depths, a podcast on creative peacebuilding. This is the Literature Review. I'd like to start off by defining the terms arts and peacebuilding. I will borrow from Michael Shank and Lisa Schirch and their article Strategic Arts-Based Peacebuilding. They chose, quote, "By arts, the authors mean an expressive vehicle for communication." In this article, the authors define the arts broadly to include both ephemeral and more classical approaches, and embrace the wide variety of forms including visual arts, literary arts, performance arts, and movement arts. By peacebuilding, the authors mean a wide range of efforts to prevent, reduce, transform, and help people recover from violence in all forms, at all levels of society, and in all stages of conflict." End quote. The name of this podcast, Unspeakable Depths, comes from a particularly relevant quote in John Paul Lederach and Angela Lederach's 2010 book, When Blood and Bones Cry Out, Journeys Through the Soundscape of Healing and Reconciliation. Quote, "The experience of violence creates an experience of unspeakable depths. Words alone attend to only a small portion of the deeper process." The arts, I believe, have a unique ability to reach those depths that words alone cannot. I will be asking my guests to relate this quote to their work. There are currently thousands of arts-based peacebuilding programs in the world using a range of approaches. Quote, "Since the peacebuilding field requires tools that are as diverse and complicated as the human spirit, the arts emerge as a logical ally." End quote. Shank and Schirch continue, quote, "The task for peacebuilding practitioners is to find strategic ways of incorporating the arts into the work of peacebuilding and to create a space where people in conflict can express themselves, heal themselves, and reconcile themselves through the arts. There is very little solid theory, research, or evaluation of arts-based peacebuilding." End quote. They attempt to, quote, "move beyond a simplistic approach that asserts the, quote, arts are powerful, to a richer articulation of how they function in peacebuilding, when to use them, what they can do, and how to evaluate their usage." End quote. The following is an extensive but not exhaustive list of the benefits of using arts in peacebuilding that I have compiled from all of the sources I will cite in this lit review. Art nurtures the intellectual and emotional capacities required for peace, including receptivity, creativity, imagination, compassion, understanding, and empathy, vitality, respect, the ability to embrace paradox, self-confidence, self-expression, self-representation, and self-definition. Art can explain emotions, ideas, or feelings that words alone cannot, can access a broader, common base of communication, and, quote, "enable the retrieval and reprocessing of traumatic memories that are often encoded in images rather than in words." End quote. Art can transform people's worldviews, identities, and relationships, allow an opportunity to creatively investigate and understand issues of peace and justice, facilitate processes of social reconciliation, reach beneath people's defenses, reclaim the body alienated by oppression, abuse, and violence, disrupt dehumanizing narratives, and invite reciprocity. The arts help people transcend narratives of powerlessness and reclaim dignity, imagine the possibility of forgiveness, and create expressions of their common humanity. Art can enable the restructuring of a coherent mental map of a world that was shattered in war or natural disaster, and a concrete envisioning of a better future as used in guided imagery in cognitive behavioral therapy, and more broadly, allow exploration of hopes and goals for the future. It teaches creative problem solving and enhances personal and community resilience. Collaborative art projects generate trust and solidarity among participants, can enhance group communication and expression, and encourage the development of interpersonal life skills. The arts are cultural equalizers, are a medium for transmitting information between generations and facilitate connections to symbols of the homeland. Art is pleasurable and enlivening, can transform negative energy into positive energy, minimize anxiety and depression, physically transform dull surroundings into a place of belonging. The arts offer resources for waging conflicts nonviolently as a highly imaginative and provocative medium for advocating the needs of vulnerable groups to power holders, balancing power, demanding attention, and mobilizing people into action. Artists can serve as mediators. The artistic medium offers, quote, a safe place for individuals to find respite and security from ongoing racial, political, or economic conflict, end quote. Quote, the arts are an important tool in liberating, transforming, and revolutionizing individuals, relationships, and societies, end quote. Quote, the arts can change the dynamics in intractable, interpersonal, intercommunal, national, and global conflicts, end quote. The arts, quote, produce work that is on the fringes of what is accepted or applauded, in places where you are unlikely to locate it, thus redefining them, and sets off small revolutions at the most surprising of times, end quote. Summarily, quote, art can create a frame around an issue or relationship that offers new perspectives and the possibility of transformation, acting like a prism that allows us to view the world through a new lens, end quote. We can categorize the impact of arts in the peacebuilding process through John Paul Lederach's framework of transformational change as personal, relational, structural, and cultural. Quote, the personal aspect of conflict refers to changes affected in and desired for the individual. This involves the full person, including the cognitive, emotional, perceptual, and spiritual dimensions. The relational dimension represents changes in face-to-face relationships. Here we consider relational affectivity, power, and interdependence, and the expressive, communicative, and interactive aspects of conflict. The structural dimension highlights the underlying causes of conflict and the patterns and changes it brings about in social, political, and economic structures. This aspect focuses attention on how social structures, organizations, and institutions are built, sustained, and changed by conflict. The cultural dimension refers to changes produced by conflict in the broadest patterns of group life, including identity and the ways that culture affects patterns of response and conflict. End quote. You can find all this in Chapter 4 of the Little Book of Conflict Transformation by John Paul Lederach. Within the personal, conflict is inseparable from trauma. Artistic approaches can be transformative because they are strength-based and allow participants to build a stronger sense of self and express themselves fully. Kimberly Clair summarizes these impacts using asylum-seeking migrants as an example in Art Making as Social Justice in Za'atari and Calais. She writes, quote, activities that encourage uninhibited self-expression, whether through verbal, physical, or visual means, and allow participants to explore their hopes and goals for the future, end quote, have been recommended by the International Medical Corps because they can, quote, address a variety of migrants' psychosocial health issues, including isolation, depression, boredom, and the desire to inflict harm on oneself or others, end quote. She continues, quote, this human-centered approach, which stands in direct contrast to a deficit or problem-based model of trauma recovery, allows refugees to see themselves as complex individuals, not merely as victims, displaced persons, or burdens on the host nation-state, end quote. Artistic approaches are also beneficial because they encourage safe exploration of ideas that are critical to changing our conceptions of ourselves in relation to the enemy or the other. Cohen states plainly, quote, to perceive our enemy more completely necessarily entails revising our understanding of ourselves as well, end quote. This brings us to the relational. At the relational level, the key to sustainable peace building is teaching and learning coexistence. Arts programs, especially collaborative ones, are humanizing, build trust among participants, and promote reconciliation through understanding. Cohen's Engaging with the Arts to Promote Coexistence is the perfect source on this. She writes, quote, "Because intergroup relations can cascade backwards in the direction of intolerance and violence, coexistence requires nourishing the attitudes, values, and capacities people need, not just to cease violence, but to build respect, understanding, and cooperation over time." End quote. Enemies can begin to appreciate their commonalities, and communication is key, Shank and Schirch say. Quote, "Arts-based peacebuilding recognizes the limitations of verbal communication and suggests practitioners use the arts to elicit information and convey meaning difficult to communicate." End quote. When studying the arts, it is important to remember that they are always inseparable from broader social contexts and struggle over cultural meanings. They are never neutral or universal. End quote. Yet, the structural and cultural impacts of arts are harder to identify. I've been able to find a couple of examples in the Huss et al. Study of Sri Lankan communities recovering from both conflict and natural disaster. First, referencing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they argue, quote, "The arts, rather than being an aspect of self-actualization to be experienced only when more basic needs are met, may be one of the means of enabling a society to meet those basic needs." End quote. This is actually closer to the hierarchy of the Blackfoot First Nations understanding of human needs, whom Maslow stole this concept from, but turned it upside down. The authors also say, quote, "One of the challenges of international aid is to become culturally relevant and to create sustainable local ownership of long-term community rehabilitation processes. The arts are a culturally contextualized medium. Therefore, they can be the basis of a model of problem-solving that is participatory and localized, rather than focused on the global knowledge of external actors." End quote. And Cohen reasons, quote, "The educational work of coexistence must reach beneath people's defenses, but do so in respectful and gentle ways that support people to configure new patterns of meaning as old patterns become obsolete." End quote. Artistic methods can provide this respectful and gentle encouragement. So, essentially, the change promoted by arts-based peacebuilding enables members of a society to work towards structural and cultural changes. Of course, like with any peacebuilding project, creative approaches can sometimes fall short. Among other challenges, quote, "The work can be difficult and trigger miscommunication and intense feelings," end quote. And it is hard to secure funding because of the perception that arts programs do not meet people's basic needs and therefore are not worth funding. I want to note that Acting Together on the World Stage with Cynthia Cohen has developed a list of areas to minimize the risk of doing harm in artistic peacebuilding activities. These include 1. Minimize the risk of engaging in epistemic violence, which is injury to local ways of knowing, cultural practices, forms of expression, etc. 2. Minimize the risk of worsening divisions between conflicting groups. 3. Minimize the risk of re-traumatizing communities and individuals that have suffered from violence. 4. Minimize the risk of undermining artistic integrity. 5. Minimize the risk of creating or perpetuating injurious power dynamics. And 6. Minimize the risks to artists, cultural workers, and project participants, particularly those working in contexts of government repression or polarized paramilitary formations. You can find their strategies for minimizing risk in the training guides at atwsresources.com. I will close out once more with Shank and Schirch. Quote, "The authors recognize that more research and analysis is needed and call upon practitioners everywhere to begin or continue articulating the reasons why and how the arts are powerful vehicles for peacebuilding. The more that is known about strategic arts-based peacebuilding and the relevant tools available, the more effectual the field of peacebuilding will be." End quote. These are the ideas that I hope you will keep in mind as you listen to the following episodes.